Why do some men stay respected, emotionally calm, and impossible to manipulate, while other men lose themselves completely the moment they fall in love? Honestly, the answer is not luck, appearance, or money alone. The difference is awareness. Some men understand relationship psychology deeply, while others walk into relationships emotionally blind, believing love alone will protect them from disappointment. And today, we are going to talk about truths many men avoid hearing, because emotionally they are uncomfortable. But once a man truly understands these truths, everything changes psychologically. He stops getting controlled through guilt, emotional games, validation, fear of abandonment, and endless chasing. He starts seeing relationship dynamics clearly instead of reacting emotionally to every shift in a woman's behavior. This is Isabella, and if you stay with me until the end of this conversation, you are going to understand why some men remain emotionally grounded in relationships, while others slowly become anxious, drained, desperate, and emotionally dependent without even noticing it happening. Because honestly, many men were raised believing love is unconditional. They were taught that if they give enough, sacrifice enough, stay loyal enough, and love hard enough, a woman will naturally stay forever. But real attraction and real relationship dynamics are often much more psychologically complicated than that. And the moment a man finally sees reality clearly instead of emotionally, the games stop working on him forever. The first truth many men need to understand is that love is not always as unconditional as they were taught growing up. And honestly, this realization emotionally destroys many men at first, because they entered relationships believing loyalty, sacrifice, patience, and endless giving would naturally guarantee permanent love in return. They believed that if they stayed faithful enough, caring enough, emotionally available enough, a woman would automatically stay deeply attached forever. But real relationships often work very differently psychologically. Many women respond strongly to security, emotional stability, confidence, ambition, consistency, discipline, and the emotional experience a man creates around them. And the difficult part for many men to accept is that when those things weaken, attraction sometimes shifts too. Not always because a woman is evil or heartless, but because attraction itself is deeply connected to emotional perception and emotional security. And honestly, this is where many men begin losing themselves without realizing it. The moment they feel affection changing, they panic emotionally. Instead of observing calmly, they start over-giving, more attention, more chasing, more sacrifices, more emotional pleading. They believe if they simply love harder, everything will return to how it used to feel in the beginning. But psychologically, desperation rarely restores attraction. In many situations, it weakens it even more, because the more a man abandons his standards, confidence, emotional control, and self-respect trying to keep someone, the more invisible his value slowly becomes emotionally over time. The painful truth is that many men do not realize they are being valued more for what they provide emotionally than for who they actually are underneath it all. And honestly, this reality usually becomes visible the moment life becomes difficult. The money slows down, the confidence weakens, the emotional energy changes, stress increases, success disappears temporarily. And suddenly, the same warmth, patience, affection, and admiration no longer feel as effortless as before. That is when many men start noticing subtle emotional shifts they previously ignored. The conversations feel colder, the respect becomes inconsistent, the affection begins feeling conditional instead of natural. And honestly, this is where many men finally wake up psychologically, because they realize attraction is often tied much more deeply to perception, value, stability, and emotional strength than they were ever taught growing up. Now, listen carefully, because this part matters deeply. This does not mean genuine love cannot exist. It means many men enter relationships emotionally blind. They judge love only through words while ignoring behavior patterns completely. They assume loyalty will always be returned equally simply because they themselves are loyal. But psychologically, people often reveal who they truly are when circumstances change, not when everything feels easy, exciting, and emotionally comfortable. And honestly, a man who refuses to see this reality early usually becomes the man who keeps sacrificing himself endlessly trying to hold together a relationship that slowly stopped valuing him emotionally a long time ago. The second truth many men completely underestimate is the power of their attention. And honestly, most men give it away far too freely without realizing how emotionally valuable it actually is psychologically. Every text, every compliment, every late-night conversation, every emotional reaction, every moment of reassurance is energy being invested into someone. And the dangerous part is that many men keep pouring this energy endlessly into women who barely reciprocate emotionally at the same level. At first, it feels harmless. A man thinks he is simply showing interest, proving loyalty, or demonstrating love, but psychologically, constant availability slowly changes how a woman experiences his presence emotionally. The more predictable, emotionally dependent, and endlessly available he becomes, the less emotional tension, curiosity, and excitement remain inside the dynamic. And honestly, this is why so many men become invisible without understanding what happened. The man constantly flooding a woman with attention often gets emotionally taken for granted because his presence feels guaranteed. She never has room to miss him, never has room to wonder about him, never has room to emotionally feel his absence because he is always there chasing, explaining, proving, reassuring, and emotionally overextending himself constantly. But the moment a man becomes more selective with his attention, more focused on his own life, goals, peace, and emotional stability, his energy immediately starts feeling different psychologically. And women notice that shift much faster than most men realize. You have probably seen this happen before, without fully understanding the psychology behind it emotionally. The man who constantly floods a woman with attention, validation, reassurance, and endless availability often gets emotionally overlooked, while the man who is more focused on his own life somehow keeps her curiosity and attention much longer without trying nearly as hard. And honestly, that difference is not accidental. Because when attention feels rare, intentional, emotionally grounded, and self-controlled, it carries far more emotional weight. A woman starts wondering about you more. She notices your absence more deeply. She becomes more emotionally aware of your presence because it no longer feels automatic or guaranteed every second of the day. Now, listen carefully because this is where many men get trapped psychologically. The more emotionally desperate a man becomes for female validation, the more his attention loses value. He starts texting constantly, chasing constantly, reacting emotionally to every mood change, over-explaining himself and abandoning his own peace trying to maintain her interest. And eventually, the relationship dynamic becomes emotionally unbalanced because she feels his fear of losing her underneath everything he does. But a man who values his own attention naturally behaves differently. He does not ignore women cruelly. He simply refuses to make one person the center of his entire emotional world. And honestly, women often feel far more emotionally drawn toward that grounded energy because it signals confidence, emotional control, self-respect, and psychological stability naturally. The third truth is emotional control. And honestly, this is where many men lose themselves completely inside relationships without even noticing it happening slowly. The moment a woman becomes distant emotionally, changes her energy, gives silent treatment, pulls away slightly, or stops showing the same affection, many men instantly panic internally. And instead of staying emotionally grounded, they begin reacting from fear, insecurity, and emotional desperation. Now, psychologically, this changes everything because emotionally reactive men are very easy to manipulate without realizing it. The more your peace depends on her moods, replies, validation, attention, or approval, the more power she naturally gains over your emotional state. And honestly, many women test this subconsciously. They observe how emotionally stable you remain under pressure. They notice whether silence controls you, whether jealousy controls you, whether fear of losing them controls you. And every time a man explodes emotionally, begs, overchases, overreacts, or loses his composure completely, he hands away emotional power without realizing it. But something changes the moment a man learns emotional discipline. When her silence no longer destroys your peace, when her mood swings no longer shake your confidence, when her emotional withdrawal no longer sends you into panic, suddenly the dynamic changes psychologically. Your calmness becomes powerful. Your steadiness becomes attractive. Your emotional control becomes impossible to manipulate easily. And honestly, women respect emotionally grounded men far more than emotionally reactive men, because calm strength always feels safer, stronger, and more masculine psychologically. The fourth truth many men need to understand is the reality of options. And honestly, this is where desperation either dies or completely controls a man's life psychologically. Most men are raised believing women are the prize, and that losing one woman means losing everything emotionally. So they cling harder, they tolerate disrespect longer, they ignore obvious red flags. They lower their standards repeatedly because deep down, they fear they may never find another woman who wants them again. And honestly, women feel that fear immediately, because a man who believes he has no options behaves very differently psychologically from a man who knows his value does not disappear because one relationship ends. The desperate man accepts crumbs emotionally because scarcity controls him internally. But a man who has spent years building himself mentally, financially, emotionally, socially, and physically understands something powerful. Options are created through self-development, not luck, and that realization changes the moment a man truly understands he can survive rejection, survive endings, survive emotional loss, and still rebuild his life stronger. Fear stops controlling his behavior psychologically. He stops begging for affection, stops tolerating manipulation, stops negotiating his dignity just to keep someone beside him emotionally. And honestly, this is why emotionally abundant men feel more attractive naturally. They are not constantly terrified of loss, and a man who is not emotionally afraid to walk away becomes much harder to control psychologically. The fifth truth is self-respect, and honestly, this is the foundation that determines whether a man stays emotionally powerful inside relationships or slowly loses himself trying to keep someone else happy constantly. Because many men enter relationships ready to give everything emotionally, while abandoning the one thing that matters most psychologically: respect for themselves. They ignore disrespect, ignore manipulation, ignore dishonesty, ignore emotional games, ignore broken boundaries, all because they are afraid of losing the woman emotionally. And honestly, the moment a man starts sacrificing his dignity just to maintain affection, the relationship usually begins damaging him internally, piece by piece. Because love without self-respect quickly turns into emotional submission psychologically. A man starts tolerating behavior he knows hurts him simply because fear of abandonment becomes stronger than loyalty to himself. But something changes completely when a man finally develops standards emotionally. He stops accepting treatment that destroys his peace. He stops over-explaining his boundaries. He stops begging people to value him correctly. And honestly, women feel this shift immediately because self-respect changes a man's entire emotional presence psychologically. A man who respects himself moves differently, speaks differently, reacts differently. He no longer chases desperately out of fear. He chooses carefully. And ironically, this is usually when women begin respecting him much more naturally too, because emotionally healthy attraction cannot survive long without genuine respect underneath it. And honestly, once a man understands all of these truths together, something inside him changes permanently psychologically. He stops approaching relationships from emotional blindness and desperation and starts approaching them with awareness, emotional discipline, and self-respect instead. Because now he understands that love alone is not enough without respect. He understands that endless chasing weakens attraction instead of strengthening it. He understands that attention is valuable, emotional control is power, options remove desperation, and self-respect determines how people ultimately treat you emotionally over time. And honestly, this is the point where many men finally stop losing themselves inside relationships completely. They stop reacting emotionally to every little shift in female behavior. They stop abandoning their goals, peace, confidence, routines, and standards, trying to keep someone emotionally attached. Instead, they become calmer, more observant, emotionally grounded, and much harder to manipulate psychologically because they are no longer operating from fear of loss constantly. And ironically, this is usually when attraction starts working differently in their favor naturally. Because emotionally healthy women are not deeply attracted to weak desperation. They are attracted to grounded confidence, emotional stability, self-respect, discipline, purpose, and a man who remains emotionally centered even under pressure. And honestly, once a man truly understands that psychologically, the games stop controlling him forever. Because now he finally sees the entire dynamic clearly, instead of emotionally reacting to it blindly. So, after everything we talked about today, here's the truth most men eventually realize too late. The moment you stop living for female approval, your entire life starts changing psychologically. Because honestly, many men are not exhausted from love itself. They are exhausted from constantly chasing validation, constantly overthinking, constantly proving themselves, constantly sacrificing their peace trying to keep someone emotionally attached to them. And eventually, that kind of desperation destroys a man from the inside. But the moment a man finally wakes up emotionally, something powerful happens. He stops handing people control over his confidence. He stops abandoning his goals, boundaries, self-respect, and emotional stability just to avoid losing somebody. Instead, he becomes calmer, sharper, more disciplined, more emotionally grounded, and far more aware of how relationships actually function psychologically. And honestly, that is when the games finally stop working on him. Silent treatment no longer controls him. Manipulation no longer controls him. Fear of losing someone no longer controls him. Emotional chaos no longer controls him. Because now he understands something most men never fully learn. A man who truly respects himself becomes emotionally difficult to break. And ironically, that is usually when women begin respecting him more naturally too. Now, I want you to be honest in the comments. Which truth hit you the hardest emotionally today? And if you enjoy these conversations about female psychology, attraction, emotional discipline, masculinity, confidence, and modern relationships, subscribe and join the community because the next videos are going even deeper into the psychology most men never get taught.